Hey, how's it going everyone? This is Imagine It with Basic Waves, and today we're going to take a look at KULT, the newest and super intriguing synth from Dawesome. KULT is a mega intriguing synth. It's really hard to explain, but it's very unique, charismatic, nice and dynamic, and there's a lot of new inventive things going on. So I'm really excited to talk about this synth. So let's go into Logic. I have the synth all loaded up, and I'm just going to break down the most basic functions and then maybe get a little bit into the more complex things, and then we'll wrap up by maybe taking a look at a couple of presets. Okay, so here we are in KULT. So to begin, let's take a look at our oscillators. Each oscillator comes with a wavetable selector here, and we'll get into these in a minute. We have a gain parameter, and as you can see here, actually, as I bring the gain up, our visual, which again we'll talk about in a second, gets closer or goes far away according to the volume that we set. This function right here, saw, is really neat. It essentially injects the harmonics of a sawtooth into whatever wavetable we have set up. Same thing for the SQ here, which is just short for squarify. So if we turn this all the way up and then play the sound, you can hear how it kind of starts to turn into a square, and you can see the square subtly representing itself here at the top of our little visual that we have. We also have a frequency shifter, which is loads of fun for experimental bass kind of stuff. Here we have an S shifter, and this essentially shifts the phase of the overall wavetable. So sonically, it's somewhat like a frequency shifter, but it focuses on shifting the phase, which is a unique function to KULT. And then lastly here, we have a phase parameter, and this just flips the phase of the wavetable from 0 to 100. And of course, our visual here changes as we adjust the phase. Now let's take a look at what makes this synth immediately unique and interesting, the wavetables. So if I click on Saw 1 right here, a menu comes up and we have all of these cool visuals as well as a bunch of interesting kind of names. We have Buali and Sequoia, Vanderpool, and then we have Tri, Saw, Saw, and Sinus. Tri, the two saws and the two sinuses here are based off of the basic shapes. So we have a lot of contemporary and really interesting options available to us, and of course what's even more interesting is that they are all represented visually very differently from one another. Maybe these signs are the only exception here. If I select Lorenz 02, this is based off of what is known in mathematical chaos theory as a strange attractor. So I'm not going to go into the science of strange attractors. I urge that you look them up to help you maybe better understand where the visual representation is coming from, but the fact that these 30 wavetables are based off of strange attractors makes for a really interesting harmonic character along with a very interesting visual. So I'm just going to go ahead and play a note. Maybe a chord. So we seem to have a bit of a triangle square, which is kind of interesting, right? Because we have, what, 4 triangles here and then a square in the middle, and then if you want to count the squares on the sides, if you want to get all meta like that, we have a bit of a triangle square tonality there, right? But it's not like your usual square and not like your usual triangle. There's a sort of interesting flavor to it, which again makes this synth immediately unique sounding. Super cool. And then of course, if I want to take Saw here and then bring this up, I'm now going to inject a little bit of sawtooth into the waveform, and you can see that happening here in our visual, giving us further sound shaping opportunities. Now, before I go any further, I do want to talk about this middle parameter here called fade, and this is basically just a crossfade between oscillators 1 and 2. So if we want more of oscillator 1, obviously we'll go all the way to the left, and if we want more of oscillator 2, we'll go all the way to the right. That's the immediate oscillator visual here in KULT. Again, we have oscillator 1 with our different parameters and then the wavetable selector. Okay, so maybe we want a little bit more functionality out of the oscillators, right? Fortunately, we can. So down here in oscillator 1, we have a few different sections to manipulate this sound coming from oscillator 1. We can first affect the pitch through transposition over semitones, and then we can also adjust the fine tuning by cents. So we can go to 100 cents or bring down 100 cents, or we can also set a fixed pitch. So if we turn on fixed here, and then if we bring this up to, I don't know, F4, every note on the keyboard is going to play in F4. Next, we have an FM parameter. So we can turn up the FM amount here. what's neat is you can see how the wavetable, the initial wavetable that we've created here, is getting affected by that FM. So if I turn this down, this is our original look, our original design. And then if we turn it up, it starts to get loose and then just goes into complete and utter chaos. But still sounds really cool. We can also play with the FM ratio. We can also quantize it by semitones. We also have amplitude modulation, so we can turn up the amount. We can turn up the amount of the LFO. We can turn up the amplitude modulation ratio. We can also quantize that by semitones, turn that off, and we can also sync the LFO to whatever rate we'd like. Now over here, we can introduce some formants or vowel to our sound. Really cool, of course, we can see how our waveform here, our visual, is getting affected by the different vowel that we're using, of course, and how much vowel we're applying. Now, lastly, we have the unison section here, and this is where we can apply more voices all the way up to 5, and we can detune them and spread. So oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 are where we would make all our voicing and modulation adjustments. So let's go ahead and take a look now directly to the left at our ARP. So I'm actually gonna go ahead and select a different wavetable for this just to make it easier for you to hear so it's not a muddy mess. All right, so back over at ARP here, we have chord. So this is where we can set up a chord, and maybe we'll turn up the detune and the spread. We get a quick and easy way of setting up chords across the keyboard. And then here we have the arpeggiator pattern as we initially looked at. So we have the rate here. We can set up a gate, a pattern. We can choose different patterns such as that. We can choose how many octaves we'd like to go up in our pattern. And then we can also adjust the length of the arpeggiator. So we can have 8 bars, maybe 5 bars. And then over here we have pitch. So this is where we would just change the overall pitch of the arpeggiator and the chords that we've set up. And we can adjust the pitch by semitones using the transposition here, or we can adjust them by octave. Now last over here, we have a scale selector, and we can choose between major, tritone, Lydian, whole tone, half diminished, all the way up to these really interesting exotic scales and even the black keys, which is neat. Or if we want to, we can set up the scale by hitting these red dots here and choose exactly the notes that we'd want. Cool, so that's the ARP section of KULT. Really cool stuff. We have a ton of options to set up some really interesting chords, set up an ARP pattern, set up the pitch, and then also a scaler, which is really, really neat. Now let's go over to the filter. So the filter is very, very basic. We essentially have 2 different filters that we can play with, as well as 2 comb filters and 2 distortion units as well. To start, we're gonna take a look at our 2 distortion units. So we have a soft distortion, our hard distortion, and a noise. Soft just adds a bit of soft distortion. Hard is going to add some hard clipping distortion, and then noise So really, really cool stuff here. Really simple too. We don't need a whole bunch of different distortion units, just some soft distortion for a little bit of warmth, maybe some hard to thicken up the sound and make it a little bit more aggressive, and then noise to add a little bit of that noisy fidelity. Next, we have the comb filter here. Very simple stuff. We have an amount parameter. So we have 100%. We can set the feedback to positive or negative. We can set the harmonic as well as the pitch, which is a really useful tool for flangey or metallic sounds. And then lastly, we have our analog in the middle here, and we have our big old cutoff knob. Let's go ahead and choose a different waveform here just for fun. We'll turn up the resonance here, which is reso. Get a funky wobble, of course. We can also turn up the drive here, and we get a little bit of analog filter drive, which is really cool for getting that analog driven sound. Now, if we turn on the other filter here, now if we turn on the second filter here, we can offset the different filters that we're using. So if we want to use a low pass 12 on filter 1 and then maybe a band pass 12 on filter 2, we can have different cutoffs set for the different filters that we're using. Next, this is where we would take a look at our effects. So let's go ahead and add some effects. The way we can do that is by going over to this window here on the right where it says no effects, click plus to add effects. So let's go ahead and do that. And available to us, we have reverb, delay, phaser, chorus, channel EQ, and then clouds and shimmer, which are two very interesting types of reverbs. So channel EQ, chorus, phaser, and delay are very contemporary, but what's really cool is we have these two reverbs that are not contemporarily named. They're very brilliantly named, in my opinion, because they sound like they are named. So if I choose clouds here, it sounds like we have this massive space, this big open sky dimension, which is really, really pretty and sounds realistic too. If we take a look at the other reverb that we have, shimmer, we get a really big, bright space that kind of sounds springy. Now, one last thing about the effects is this section down here for the effects looks pretty much the same regardless of the effect that we're choosing. So if I choose delay, we get these bars here, kind of similar to the Valhalla stuff, if you're familiar with it. If I just go ahead and add a bunch of stuff, they all look the same. So we don't have to worry about certain parameters looking differently or anything like that. It's just very intuitive and very cohesive. Okay, so that's the effects section in KULT. Now let's take a look at the mod here. And this is where we would see all of our modulations going on, including the main ADSR. And as you'd expect, it looks like most ADSR envelopes would look like. We have an attack, a decay, a sustain, and a release. And we could set these different parameters using these bars right here. But we can also use these points on the graph as well to set what we'd like. It's a bit like Serum in that way, but it just makes for a really intuitive experience in setting up your envelopes. We have our different types of modulation that we can apply. So we can apply pressure modulation to whatever parameter, slide, velocity, lift, glide, the pitch bend wheel, and key track. These are all really, really powerful for cinematic effects and MPE style sounds. We can also apply a mod wheel, ADSR, LFO, some steps, and then we can also apply some random modulation, which is really, really cool. Okay, so before we wrap up, just a couple other things to take a look at. Down here, we have our output and a couple really cool things. This is where we can hit the panic button. So if we have a really loud, obnoxious sound and it's not ending and maybe it's getting muddy in the entire mix, we can go ahead and press that and it will just silence the synth, which is really, really handy. And then down here we can select the oversampling. So if we want to have eco, smart, high, extreme, ultra, we can set that according to whatever CPU headspace that we have. Or if we want to set the oversampling per patch, we can go ahead and hit G and that'll turn into a P, and we can set this patch in particular to maybe ultra. And then if we want to select a different patch, we can set that to whatever one of these that we'd like. That way, if we want to have a really high fidelity sound somewhere in our song, and this is really handy in that if we want to have a really high fidelity sound, but don't have the CPU for maybe a bunch of instances of high fidelity, we can set those patches particularly to a lower rate, where something high fidelity, such as a cinematic sound, might benefit more so from having ultra set up. And then lastly, we have 314 different patches to choose from that have been set up by the good people at Dawesome. These are all incredible presets. I'm just gonna go ahead and select a couple. Cool, so a lot of interesting presets going on there. We have some cinematic pads and effects, and then maybe some IDM glitches and things like that. So I would say this synth is best summed up as a really interesting and intriguing way of looking and conceptualizing sound design while also having a nice dynamic range of possibilities where you're not stuck making very cerebral, again, IDM-y kind of sounds because it is intrinsically IDM-y or philosophically at a high level created, right? It's not necessarily fit for just one particular thing, which is its biggest strength. So whatever genre you're in, whatever style of music you're making, and regardless of your skill level, this is a really cool synth to check out at least, and just try out. It's a great tool for experimenting in as well as getting some really high quality contemporary sounds. But that's it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed. As always, you can reach out to me at my email, which is imimagineit@gmail.com, or across all socials at imimagineit. You can also check out my work at my website, which is imimagineit.com. But until then, I will see you in the next review. Bye for now.